Bismarck, Dakota Territory, September 14, 1883. Lars Haugen, a Norwegian immigrant who'd arrived just 8 months prior, was building something his neighbors called the dumbest waste of good clay anyone ever seen. While every other homesteader in the settlement was building standard rope beds with corn husk mattresses, Lars was constructing what looked like a massive bread oven in the corner of his cabin. He'd hauled 2,400 pounds of river clay mixed with prairie grass up from the Missouri bottomlands. He'd shaped it into a platform 4 feet wide, 6.5 feet long, and 14 inches thick. His neighbors watched him work and shook their heads. Samuel Becker, a German homesteader who'd survived 3 Dakota winters, stood outside Lars's cabin on that September afternoon and said it plain, "You're building a clay coffin, friend. That thing'll suck the warmth right out of you. Clay holds cold like iron holds heat. You'll wake up frozen stiff come January." Becker had built 17 cabins across 3 territories. He knew frontier construction. His word carried weight in the settlement. Mary O'Connor, an Irish widow who ran the settlement's boarding house, was even more direct. She'd seen men die from cold in her 12 years on the plains. "That Norwegian's gonna kill himself with foolishness," she told anyone who'd listen. Clay beds? What's next, ice blankets? The man's brain froze before winter even started. Even James Whitmore, the settlement's only educated man, a former schoolteacher from Philadelphia who'd come west for his health, considered Lars's project absurd. The specific heat capacity of clay is demonstrably inferior to wool or down, Whitmore explained to a group at Becker's cabin. The man is scientifically illiterate. He's applying old-world superstition to new-world conditions. But Lars kept working. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just mixed clay, shaped it with his thick hands, and let it dry in the late summer sun. By October 1st, his bed platform was complete and cured. He'd built a small firebox into one end, with a flue that ran the length of the clay mass before exiting through his cabin wall. The whole contraption weighed somewhere near 2,800 pounds when fully dried. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand that 3 experienced frontier settlers had completely missed? What ancestral knowledge had travelled with him across the Atlantic that would prove more valuable than all of Samuel Becker's 17 cabins combined? Before we reveal exactly how Lars's clay bed worked and why it saved his life, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now let's see what happened when Dakota winter arrived. The ridicule didn't stop with completion. It intensified. Samuel Becker organized what he called a teaching moment on October 8th. He brought 6 men to Lars's cabin to demonstrate proper bed construction. "Look here," Becker said, gesturing at his own rope bed frame with its thick corn husk mattress. "Rope gives you suspension, air circulation. The husk provides insulation without holding moisture. It's proven frontier technology. This clay monster?" He knocked on Lars's creation. "This is thermal suicide." The numbers seemed to support Becker's position. A standard rope bed with corn husk mattress weighed maybe 40 pounds. It could be moved, adjusted, even taken apart and rebuilt. Lars's clay platform was permanent, immobile, and represented 3 weeks of backbreaking labor. If it didn't work, he couldn't just throw it out and start over. Mary O'Connor brought the women's perspective. "A proper feather bed holds heat close to your body," she explained to her boarding house guests. "You want insulation between you and the cold, not some clay slab that'll leach every bit of warmth you got. I've got Finnish boarders, Swedish boarders, even 2 Norwegian families. None of them sleep on clay. They know better." James Whitmore provided the scientific argument. He'd calculated that clay has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0. 2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, compared to wool at 0.32 and down feathers at 0.45. "The mathematics are irrefutable," he announced at the settlement's Sunday gathering. "Haugen's bed will perform 37% worse than a wool mattress and 56% worse than down. The man has built a heat sink in the worst possible location. By mid-October, Lars had become the settlement joke. Children ran past his cabin yelling, clay man, gonna freeze like a clay pan." 3 different families offered him their spare rope beds. One even offered to help him dismantle the clay platform before you get too attached to your mistake. But Lars kept his silence and continued his preparations. He'd built something else his neighbors hadn't noticed. A woodshed attached directly to his cabin with a feed door that allowed him to stoke his clay bed's firebox without going outside. He'd cut and stacked 8 cords of cottonwood, more than double what Becker recommended for a single man's winter needs. His neighbors saw the excessive woodpile as more evidence of poor planning. What Lars understood, and what his critics had never considered, was thermal mass and radiant heat storage. His clay bed wasn't insulation, it was a battery. In the mountains of Norway, in the Gudbrandsdal Valley where Lars grew up, stone beds heated by masonry stoves had kept families alive through winters that made Dakota look mild. The principle was ancient, refined over centuries of Scandinavian experience. You didn't try to insulate yourself from cold with dead air and fibers. You stored massive quantities of heat in dense material and let that material radiate warmth for hours after the fire went out. Clay, when formed into sufficient mass, has remarkable heat storage properties. While Whitmore was technically correct about specific heat capacity, he'd missed the critical variable: mass. Lars's 2,800-pound clay bed could store approximately 560 BTUs per degree of temperature increase. A 40-pound corn husk mattress, even with superior specific heat, could store maybe 8 BTUs per degree. The clay bed held 70 times more thermal energy. The physics worked like this. Lars would burn a small fire in the bed's firebox for 2 to 3 hours each evening. Hot gases from combustion would travel through the flue channel embedded in the clay, heating the entire mass from within. The clay would absorb that heat. Not quickly, but steadily. Surface temperature would reach 95 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Then Lars would close the firebox damper and let the mass radiate. A 2,800-pound mass at 105 degrees cooling to 70 degrees releases approximately 19,600 BTUs. Released slowly over 8 to 10 hours, that's 2,000 to 2,450 BTUs per hour of gentle radiant heat. For comparison, a human body at rest generates about 400 BTUs per hour. Samuel Becker's corn husk mattress generated 0 BTUs and provided maybe 1.5 R value of insulation. This wasn't Norwegian invention. It was Norwegian application of a principle older than written history. Korean ondel floors had used the same concept for over 1,000 years. Heated stone or clay mass beneath living spaces, warmed by flue gases, radiating for hours. Plains Indians had used heated stones in sleeping areas for centuries. Alpine Europeans had built ceramic tile stoves with integral sleeping benches since the 1500s. The technology was proven, refined, and reliable. Where critics were partially right, clay does conduct heat faster than fiber insulation, but they missed the purpose. Lars wasn't trying to trap his body heat. He was trying to sleep next to a 2,800-pound heater that would stay warm all night. The clay's thermal conductivity was a feature, not a bug. It allowed heat to move from the internal flue to the sleeping surface efficiently. The exact construction sequence mattered, and Lars had followed it with precision learned from his father and grandfather. He'd started by excavating an area 4 feet 2 inches wide by 6 feet 8 inches long, going down 8 inches below the cabin's packed earth floor. This depression he'd filled with river stones, each roughly 3 to 5 inches in diameter, creating a drainage layer and thermal break between the frozen ground and his heated mass. The stone layer prevented ground moisture from wicking into the clay, while also preventing heat loss downward into frozen soil. On top of that stone base, he'd built the clay platform in 3 distinct layers, each serving specific purposes. The bottom layer, 6 inches thick, contained the flue channel, a serpentine path that ran 14 feet 2 inches from firebox entrance to exterior exit. The channel dimensions were critical, 4 inches wide by 3 inches tall, sized to create optimal draft while maximizing contact surface with surrounding clay. Too large and hot gases would rush through without transferring heat. Too small, and the system would smoke. Lars had calculated these dimensions through trial and error in Norway. The middle layer, 4 inches thick, was pure structural thermal mass, 3 parts river clay to 1 part dried prairie grass mixed with just enough water to achieve workable consistency. The grass fibers prevented cracking during drying and added minor insulating value to slow heat loss from the top surface. This layer weighed approximately 1,400 pounds and served as the primary heat battery. The top layer, 4 inches thick, used finer clay with less grass content, maybe 1 part grass to 5 parts clay. Lars had smoothed this surface carefully, creating a sleeping area that was comfortable against skin while still allowing efficient heat transfer. He'd mixed in a small amount of fine sand to reduce stickiness and improve durability. This top layer weighed approximately 600 pounds and served as the heat radiator. Between layers, Lars had used no mortar or separation. He'd built each layer directly onto the previous one while the clay was still slightly damp, ensuring complete thermal bonding. The result was a true monolithic structure, one continuous mass of clay without air gaps or thermal breaks that would reduce heat transfer efficiency. He'd left the clay structure to cure for 3 weeks, a process that couldn't be rushed. Week 1, the surface dried, but the interior remained damp. Week 2, moisture continued migrating outward, and small surface cracks appeared. Lars filled these with wet clay slurry. Week 3, the mass reached equilibrium, dry enough to handle heat without steam generation, but retaining enough moisture to prevent brittleness. Rapid drying would have caused structural cracks that would leak heat and reduce efficiency. The final cured structure represented 2,800 pounds of thermal mass with an effective heat storage capacity that dwarfed any conventional frontier bed. At a temperature differential of 35 degrees Fahrenheit, heating from 70 to 105 degrees, the bed could store 19 to 600 BTUs. That was the equivalent of completely burning 2.3 pounds of dry cottonwood. But unlike burning wood in a stove, which releases heat in a brief intense burst that mostly escapes through the cabin walls, the clay bed released that heat slowly over 8 to 10 hours. This slow release matched human sleep cycles perfectly and minimized waste heat loss. Compare that to Samuel Becker's rope bed with corn husk mattress, total mass, 40 pounds. Heat storage capacity from 70 to 105 degrees, maybe 420 BTUs at best. The clay bed stored 46 times more heat. Even if Becker had climbed into bed with a 40-pound heated stone, it would have cooled to ambient temperature within 90 minutes. Lars's 2,800-pound bed stayed warm for 10 hours. The mass difference was everything. Samuel Becker's rope bed with cornhusk mattress, for all its frontier practicality, could store approximately the thermal energy of burning 1/10 of 1 pound of wood, released over maybe 1 hour. The mathematical advantage was 40 to 1 in favor of thermal mass. But mathematics meant nothing to the settlement. They needed proof. Winter would provide it. November 11th, 1883. The first real cold arrived, not the frost of October, but true Dakota cold. Temperature dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, with 30-mile-per-hour winds out of the northwest. Samuel Becker burned through half a cord of wood that week, keeping his cabin at 55 degrees. He slept under 4 wool blankets and still woke up cold at 3 a.m. when his fire died to coals. Lars burned 1/4 cord. His cabin stayed at 62 degrees. He slept under 1 blanket on his clay bed, which remained at 90 degrees until dawn. He woke up warm every morning. Mary O'Connor's boarding house went through 3 cords in 10 days. Her Finnish and Swedish boarders, who'd requested the warmest rooms, complained bitterly about cold feet and morning chill. The Irish widow added extra blankets and charged more for firewood. Her profit margin disappeared into the stove. James Whitmore, the settlement's scientific authority, conducted his own experiment. He placed a thermometer next to his wool-mattressed rope bed at midnight after his fire burned down. Temperature read 41 degrees by 4 a.m. He placed another thermometer on his kitchen table, center of the cabin. 43 degrees. His bed provided 2 degrees of advantage over ambient air. He burned through wood at rates that would make spring arrival questionable. But these were just cold nights. Uncomfortable, expensive, but survivable. The settlement had weathered worse. Men grumbled, women added layers, children slept near stoves. This was normal frontier winter. This was expected. Until December 18th, 1883. The blizzard arrived on a Thursday evening with no warning. Temperature plunged from 26 degrees at noon to -18 by sunset. Wind screamed out of Canada at 45 miles per hour sustained, gusting to 70. Snow fell so thick a man couldn't see his own fence line. The storm would last 4 days and 3 nights, with temperatures bottoming out at -33 degrees on the second night. Samuel Becker's cabin, built to standard frontier specifications with 8-inch logs, chinked with mud and moss, began losing heat immediately. His single-wall construction, which performed adequately in normal winter cold, was simply overwhelmed by -33-degree temperatures and 70-mile-per-hour wind. Every tiny gap in his chinking became a heat leak. Every imperfect log joint whistled with infiltrating cold air. By midnight of the first night, despite his stove being red-hot and fed constantly, interior temperature had dropped to 38 degrees. The stove was radiating enormous heat, but that heat was escaping through walls faster than wood could generate it. By 2 a.m., Becker's water bucket had a 1/4 inch of ice on top. By dawn, the cabin had stabilized at 34 degrees. That was as warm as he could get it, regardless of how much wood he burned. He was going through 1 cord every 20 hours. At that rate, his carefully calculated winter supply of 40 cords would last maybe 50 more days. The calendar said December 19th. Spring wouldn't arrive until late March. He had 95 days of winter ahead and wood for 50. His wife, Emma, developed a harsh cough by the second morning. The constant inhalation of cold air was damaging her respiratory system. She wrapped herself in 4 blankets and still shivered. Their 7-year-old daughter, Sarah, had chilblains on her toes and fingers by day 2, the early stage of frostbite from prolonged exposure to cold that wasn't quite freezing, but was cold enough to damage tissue over time. The child cried from pain when her feet warmed slightly near the stove. Becker watched his daughter suffer and understood he was facing genuine crisis. This wasn't discomfort. This was danger. By the 3rd day, Becker was making impossible calculations. Burn wood to keep his family alive, run out in February and face late winter storms with no fuel, or reduce burning now, accept colder conditions, try to stretch supplies to March, and risk Emma's cough becoming pneumonia or Sarah's chilblains becoming gangrene. There was no good choice. Mary O'Connor's boarding house fared even worse. The large building, 24 feet by 36 feet with 2 stories, had been designed for summer comfort with good ventilation. Those same design features that made August bearable made December impossible. The building had 42 window panes across 8 windows. Each pane leaked cold air at its putty seal. The upstairs floor, built from 1-inch pine boards, leaked heat upward like a sieve. Her massive stone fireplace, which worked well in October, couldn't begin to heat 1,728 square feet of interior space in -33-degree weather. She burned 5 cords in the first 3 days and still couldn't keep the main room above 45 degrees. The kitchen, closest to the fireplace, stayed at 50. The upstairs bedrooms, where 8 boarders slept, dropped to 32 degrees. Ice formed on the inside of windows, actual ice indoors, while the fireplace roared. Her boarders burned candles in their rooms for supplemental heat, a dangerous practice that nearly caused a fire on the second night. One elderly Swedish man, Gustaf Andersson, aged 68, was particularly vulnerable. On the morning of December 20th, his roommate, a younger Finnish carpenter named Mikko Virtanen, found Gustaf barely responsive in his bed. The old man had slept in 32-degree temperature all night, his body unable to generate sufficient heat under 3 wool blankets. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow, his body core temperature at 94 degrees. Virtanen carried him downstairs to the fireplace, understanding that Gustaf was entering the early stages of hypothermia. Without intervention, the old man would slip into unconsciousness and die within hours. James Whitmore's cabin, built with his Philadelphia standards of superior craftsmanship, performed better than most, but still fell devastatingly short of adequate. His walls featured 8-inch logs with double-thick chinking. His roof had been layered with sod for extra insulation. His windows fit snugly in their frames. By frontier standards, his construction was exemplary. By the standards of -33-degree wind, it was inadequate. Even with his superior chinking and double-thick walls, Whitmore couldn't keep his cabin above 52 degrees, despite continuous burning. He was going through wood at triple his calculated rate. More troubling from a scientific standpoint, his careful measurements showed that his wool mattress, despite its superior 0.32 BTU per pound per degree, Fahrenheit-specific heat capacity, remained at cabin ambient temperature. When his fire died to coals at 2 a.m., his cabin cooled to 47 degrees. His wool mattress cooled to 47 degrees. His body had to generate all the heat needed to maintain 98-degree core temperature against a 47-degree mattress. The insulating value of wool slowed his heat loss, but it didn't generate any heat. He woke up cold every morning with an aching back from shivering-induced muscle tension. His thermometer measurements told a devastating story. On the night of December 19th, he placed thermometers at 6 locations: beside his bed, on his kitchen table in cabin center, on the floor near the stove at ceiling level near his door, and outside. At midnight, with his fire burning hot, the readings were bed area 49 degrees, table center 51 degrees, floor near stove 68 degrees, ceiling 55 degrees, near door 43 degrees, outside -22 degrees. By 4 a.m., with his fire down to coals, bed area 41 degrees, table center 43 degrees, floor near stove 47 degrees, ceiling 45 degrees, near door 38 degrees, outside -27 degrees. The data confirmed what he'd intellectually understood but hadn't fully appreciated. A cabin is a heat loss system, and conventional frontier construction couldn't generate heat fast enough to overcome losses in extreme cold. His superior specific heat capacity calculations had been correct in isolation, but meaningless in application. Insulation matters when you have a heat source. But his wool mattress wasn't a heat source. It was just slow heat loss instead of fast heat loss. He was still losing, just slightly slower. Across the settlement, 12 families faced the same crisis. Wood supplies that should have lasted until March were disappearing in days. Children were getting sick, the elderly were at risk, and the blizzard showed no signs of stopping. On the morning of December 20th, with wind still howling and temperature at -27 degrees, Samuel Becker made a decision. He wrapped Sarah in blankets, told Emma to stay by the stove, and fought his way through waist-deep drifts to Lars Haugen's cabin. The distance was only 300 yards. It took him 20 minutes. His face was frost-burned, his fingers numb inside 2 pairs of mittens. He pounded on Lars's door, not knowing what to expect. Lars opened the door in his shirt sleeves. The blast of warm air that hit Samuel Becker's face was the first genuine warmth he'd felt in 3 days. He stumbled inside and just stood there, amazed. Lars's cabin was warm, not 50 degrees warm, not tolerable if you're wearing 3 layers warm. Actually warm, the kind of warm you'd expect from a cabin in October, not in the middle of the worst blizzard Dakota Territory had seen in a decade. There was no roaring fire. The stove had burned down to coals. The clay bed sat in the corner, radiating heat like a small sun. Becker walked over and held his hands near it. The surface was still hot to the touch. He guessed 95 degrees or so. The entire corner of the cabin was warm. The opposite corner, 15 feet away, was maybe 65 degrees. The cabin's average temperature was probably 68 degrees, in minus 27-degree weather, with minimal fire. "How much wood you burning?" Becker asked. His voice was hoarse from 3 days of breathing cold air. "Quarter cord every 2 days, Lars said. His English was heavily accented but clear. "I burn small fire 3 hours before sleep. Bed stays warm until morning. Cabin stays warm all day from yesterday's heat." Becker did the math in his head. He was burning 2 cords every 2 days trying to maintain 40 degrees. Lars was burning 1/8 of that and maintaining nearly 70 degrees. The efficiency difference was 16 to 1. The comfort difference was immeasurable. "The bed," Becker said. It wasn't a question. "The bed," Lars confirmed. "In Gudbrandsdal, my family had stone bed heated by masonry stove. Same principle. Heavy mass holds heat long time. Light material holds heat short time. Your corn husk is good insulation, but no heat storage. My clay is excellent heat storage." "I called you a fool," Becker said. "You were wrong," Lars said without judgment. "You want to bring your family here? Bed is big enough for 5 people. You can sleep warm tonight." That evening, Samuel Becker returned with Emma and Sarah. Mary O'Connor brought Gustaf Andersson, the hypothermic Swedish boarder. James Whitmore came an hour later, his scientific certainty shattered by empirical reality. 8 people slept in Lars Haugen's 14 by 16-foot cabin that night. The clay bed radiated enough heat to keep the entire space at 65 degrees until morning. Lars burned 1/4 cord of wood. Across the settlement, empty cabins went cold as families abandoned their frigid homes and sought warmth wherever they could find it. The blizzard finally broke on December 22nd. When neighbors emerged from their cabins to assess damage, the toll was clear. The settlement had burned through approximately 40% of its total winter wood supply in 4 days. At that consumption rate, they'd run out by late February. 3 elderly people had developed severe cold-related illness. 1 man lost 2 toes to frostbite. 2 families were preparing to abandon their claims and return east because they couldn't face another storm like that without adequate wood. And then there was Lars Haugen's cabin, warm and secure, with wood supplies barely touched. On December 23rd, Samuel Becker returned to Lars's cabin with a notebook and pencil. "I need to understand this," he said. "All of it. How you built it, how it works, what I got wrong." Lars walked him through every detail. The mass calculation. You needed at least 2,500 pounds of clay to store enough heat for an 8-hour sleep period. The flue design, serpentine path, 14 to 18 feet long, positioned 2 inches below the sleeping surface for optimal heat transfer. The firebox sizing, small enough for efficient combustion, large enough to burn for 3 hours unattended. The clay mixture, 3 parts river clay to 1 part dried prairie grass, mixed wet, formed in layers, dried slowly. The base insulation, 8 inches of stone to prevent ground contact and heat loss downward. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button and comment below telling me what other historical frontier innovations you want me to investigate. Now, let's see what happened when the settlement learned the truth about thermal mass. Becker took notes for 2 hours. Then he asked the critical question: how much does it cost? Lars had tracked everything. River clay was free but required 3 days of digging and hauling with a wagon. Prairie grass was free, 1 day of harvesting. Stone for the base required 2 days of collection from the Missouri River. Firebox materials, scrap iron for the door, rocks for the combustion chamber were essentially free. Total material cost, $0. Total labor, 7 days for a solo builder, maybe 4 days with help. Tools required, shovel, wagon, hands. Compare that to a rope bed frame with cornhusk mattress. Lumber for frame cost $2, rope cost $1.50. Corn husks were free but required processing. Total material cost $3.50. Total labor 1 day. Tools required saw, drill, knife. The initial investment for the clay bed was higher in time but lower in money, but the operational cost difference was devastating. Lars's quarter cord per 2 days consumption rate meant he'd burn approximately 18 cords for a full Dakota winter. Samuel Becker, trying to maintain merely tolerable temperature, was burning through 40 cords. The difference was 22 cords at $3 per cord, $66 saved per winter. For frontier families operating on cash incomes of maybe $200 per year, $66 was a third of annual earnings. The clay bed paid for itself in comfort and cash savings in a single season. After that, it was pure advantage forever. James Whitmore, the settlement's scientific mind, requested permission to take measurements. On December 26th, with Lars's permission, he conducted a systematic study. Using 3 thermometers, he tracked temperatures at multiple locations over a 24-hour period. The data was conclusive. At 8 p.m., Lars burned his evening fire for 2 hours and 45 minutes, consuming approximately 8 pounds of cottonwood. By 11 p.m., the clay bed surface temperature reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit. The cabin interior, measured at center, was 71 degrees. Exterior temperature was -4 degrees. Heat loss through cabin walls was significant, but the radiant heat from the bed compensated easily. At midnight, Lars closed the firebox damper and went to sleep. Whitmore continued measurements hourly through the night. By 1 a.m., bed surface was 104 degrees. Cabin interior was 68 degrees. By 3 a.m., bed surface was 98 degrees. Cabin interior was 66 degrees. By 6 a.m., bed surface was 91 degrees. Cabin interior was 63 degrees. By 8 a.m., when Lars woke, bed surface was 86 degrees. Cabin interior was 61 degrees. The bed had cooled 22 degrees over 9 hours. It had released approximately 61,000 to 600 BTUs during that period, the equivalent of burning 7.5 pounds of wood, but released slowly and continuously instead of in one brief burst from a stove. The cabin had remained comfortable for sleeping the entire night. No middle-of-the-night cold wake-ups, no shivering under blankets, just steady, radiant warmth. Whitmore compared this to his own rope bed experience. His wool mattress started at ambient cabin temperature, maybe 50 degrees, when his fire died. By morning, cabin and mattress were both 42 degrees. His bed provided zero heat generation, only insulation that slowed body heat loss. He woke up cold every morning. Lars woke up warm every morning. The difference wasn't marginal. It was the difference between surviving winter and living through winter comfortably. "I was wrong," James Whitmore said on December 27th, standing in Mary O'Connor's boarding house in front of 17 settlement families. "I calculated specific heat capacity and ignored thermal mass. I focused on insulation and ignored heat storage. I dismissed ancestral knowledge as superstition and missed fundamental physics. Lars Haugen's clay bed is scientifically superior to conventional frontier sleeping arrangements by every meaningful metric. I apologize for my arrogance." Mary O'Connor spoke next. "I've got 12 boarders and 2 beds that work like Lars's would keep 6 of them warm instead of all of them cold. I was wrong too. I'm asking Lars to help me build 2 heated bed platforms in my upstairs rooms. Samuel Becker stood last. I called this man a fool. I organized neighbors to mock him. I was wrong on every count. I'm asking Lars to teach me how to build this for my family. I'll trade labor, materials, whatever he needs. Lars's response defined the rest of that winter. No trade necessary. I show everyone how to build. This knowledge is not mine to sell. This knowledge is for everyone to survive. Over the next 6 weeks, Lars Haugen helped 17 families build heated clay beds. He didn't charge money. He didn't demand favors. He spent his days moving from cabin to cabin, showing men and women how to mix clay, form flue channels, build fireboxes, create sleeping surfaces. He shared every specification, every measurement, every technique he'd learned in Norway and refined in Dakota. The designs varied slightly based on cabin size and family needs. Single men built beds 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, roughly 2,500 pounds of mass. Families with children built beds 5 feet wide and 8 feet long, nearly 4,000 pounds of mass, capable of sleeping 4 people. One family built a corner installation that wrapped in an L shape, creating heated sleeping space for 6 with shared thermal mass of 5,500 pounds. All followed the same core principles. Minimum 2,500 pounds of clay for adequate heat storage, serpentine flue channel 14 to 18 feet long, firebox sized for 3-hour burn time, sleeping surface positioned 2 to 3 inches above the hottest point of the flue for optimal heat transfer without risk of burns. By February 15, 1884, 23 families in the settlement had heated clay beds operational. The results were immediate and quantifiable. Settlement-wide wood consumption dropped 42% compared to the previous winter. Not a single case of severe cold-related illness occurred after Christmas. No families abandoned their claims. Children stopped getting sick from sleeping in cold rooms. The economic impact was equally dramatic. 23 families saved an average of $60 per family in reduced wood consumption, $1,380 total, for a settlement of maybe 120 people. In frontier economy terms, that represented 6 homesteaders' full annual cash income. Samuel Becker became an evangelist for the technology, building heated beds in 4 cabins beyond his own. I was the loudest critic, he told people. Now I'm the loudest advocate. This isn't Norwegian magic. This is physics we should have understood. Mary O'Connor rebuilt her boarding house arrangements around heated clay platforms. By autumn of 1884, she had 4 heated beds accommodating 12 boarders. Her winter wood consumption dropped 63%, and she operated at 50% higher profit margin. James Whitmore wrote a detailed technical paper published in Scientific American's July 1884 issue under the title Thermal Mass Sleeping Platforms, Ancestral Technology Applied to Frontier Conditions. The publication brought heated bed technology to settlements across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. By 1886, heated clay beds had spread to 43 settlements across Dakota Territory. Variations appeared based on local materials: stone instead of clay where rock was available, elevated platforms for better heat circulation. German settlers, Russian Mennonites, and even skeptical Yankees adopted the technology after experiencing one winter with frozen water buckets beside their rope beds. In 3 years, the technique transformed from absurd Norwegian superstition to essential frontier technology. Lars Haugen died on April 3, 1921, at age 74. His original cabin stood until 1956. The principle remains validated by modern building science. Thermal mass heating is now recognized in sustainable architecture. University studies confirm what Lars knew intuitively. Dense materials store and release heat far more effectively than insulation alone. Organizations like the Masonry Heater Association document that heated masonry beds, similar to Lars's clay bed, are still built today in Scandinavia, Central Europe, and increasingly in North America. The technology Lars's neighbors mocked is now taught in architecture schools as rocket mass heaters or heated masonry benches. The tragedy is how close this knowledge came to being lost. If Lars had listened to his critics in October 1883, the settlement might have lost multiple families to that December blizzard. Instead, his quiet persistence saved lives and transformed frontier building practices across an entire territory. The lesson isn't that experts are always wrong. Samuel Becker did have 17 cabins of experience. James Whitmore did understand specific heat capacity. Mary O'Connor did know frontier survival. They weren't stupid. They worked from incomplete information and cultural assumptions about proper frontier technology. They dismissed Lars's approach because it was foreign and didn't match their expectations. But Lars knew something they didn't. He carried knowledge refined over centuries of Scandinavian winter survival and trusted his heritage more than his neighbors' opinions. When crisis came, his knowledge proved superior to their skepticism. That's the deeper story. It's not about clay beds specifically. It's about the value of traditional knowledge, the danger of dismissing unfamiliar approaches, and the importance of empirical testing over theoretical certainty. Lars's neighbors were certain he was wrong until measurements proved otherwise. How many other traditional techniques were lost because settlers dismissed them as superstition? How many ancestral innovations were abandoned because immigrants wanted to fit in with neighbors who knew better? The heated clay bed survived because Lars was stubborn enough to build it despite mockery, and because Dakota winter was harsh enough to prove its value undeniably. That's the tragedy and the lesson. Traditional knowledge carries value earned through generations of trial and error. Dismissing it as primitive or superstitious is intellectual arrogance. The modern frontier approach of rope beds and blankets wasn't superior to the ancient Scandinavian approach of thermal mass beds. It was just different, and in Dakota conditions, it was demonstrably inferior. Give this video a like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what other historical building techniques you want me to investigate. Next time, we're diving into how a Scottish stonemason's angled fireplace design in Kentucky kept cabins 40% warmer while using half the wood, and how his neighbors called him crazy until the coldest winter in state history proved him right. You won't want to miss it.